We're going to take an in-depth look into coolers, and we're starting right now. Thanks to all the support from patrons and channel members. It takes a while to make one of these, and your support is appreciated. Welcome to A Star Citizen's Guide to the Galaxy. What's up, citizens? This is SubliminaL here, and in this guide, I will explain my understanding of how coolers work on paper, including cooling rate, max cooling rate, and how draw request time affects cooling. Then, I'll show you some tests that I've completed live on Twitch to see how these metrics affect your components and the ship. Spoiler alert, they don't really do shit. Well, they do, but you probably don't need to upgrade them. I may be completely wrong about some of the info in this guide, and that's okay because we're all learning throughout this journey in Star Citizen's Alpha that is constantly changing. The pinned comment will be used to ensure accuracy. This is part 2 of a series that will cover each archetype of component and weapon in depth, so make sure you're subscribed and have the bell clicked for more. Enough with the formalities, let's get to it. Regardless of the testing shown here today, coolers are an important component on your ship in Star Citizen. After all, if you power them down, this happens.
Danger. Shields overheating. Danger. Engines overheating. Danger. System overheating. Low power to engines. Low power to weapon systems.
Your ship is now dead and will need an insurance claim to be operational again. PSA to new players, please note the RSI website is not a recommended source for current and updated information on ships, components, or weapons. I highly recommend Referral.games for up-to-date info that is gathered straight from the game's data. To understand how cooling works in Star Citizen, think of heated coolant flowing into a cooler. Your cooling rate is how much coolant is currently being cooled by your coolers. To understand cooling rate, let's take a look at a Saber build I made over at Referral.games. We'll be taking a look at the stock bracer coolers. Your cooling rate is listed here in white. This rate is not static, it depends on a lot of things. Luckily, Referral has these things toggleable. As you can see, maneuvering, firing, and whether or not your shields are charging is a huge factor in how much coolant will be pushed through your coolers, amongst other factors that don't pertain to this particular ship. If cooling rate is the amount of coolant being cooled, then you guessed it, max cooling rate is the maximum amount of coolant the cooler can handle. This is static and only changes if you change your coolers. If you exceed this capacity, then you will have issues. The best way to know if you have insufficient cooling is if you hear any of these.
Danger. Engines overheating. Danger. System overheating. Low power to engines. Low power to weapon systems.
To make sure this doesn't happen, just plug your build into Referral, and if you see this, you need to make some changes before heading out to the verse. If not, you're good to go. Also, Referral does not factor in overclocking, so if you plan to do so, it's best to leave yourself some headroom. Back to the coolers. The problem is, the pipes that lead to your components cannot be changed by using a different cooler. The size of these pipes are determined by the component or the weapon itself. So by thinking that upgrading your coolers will lengthen the time before your weapons overheat, you're essentially asking for the ship or the component's pipes to be widened, and that's not currently possible. This is how the system currently works, but there are plans to change this in the future. Small rant incoming. You can skip to the timestamp on screen if you already know what I'm talking about. One thing I want to touch on really quickly is my use of the term kilo per second. The game files where Referral extracts its data from state that the Zero Rush, for example, has a cooling rate of 238,000. Since this is a video game, there is no unit of measurement. Code does not care about that. So when I say 238 kilos per second, I'm just simply stating that there are 238 thousands. Kilo is not kilograms or kilometers, simply kilo meaning a denotator for 1,000. Because saying 238,000 cooling per second sounds a little silly. And it gets even sillier if we're talking about the size 3 Chillmax coolers with 17,600,000 cooling. Now, since the surface of our sun is 5,700 degrees Kelvin, I'm inclined to believe that this is not the case. And again, since this is a video game, it can be measured in cheeseburgers for all I care. Sorry for the rant, let's get back to it. Now for the more complicated part, how request time affects your coolers. We'll be looking at 2 different coolers, the quick Zero Rushes and the beefy Ultra Flows. The Zero Rush has a cooling rate of 238 kilos per second and a request time of 3 seconds. What you have to understand is from the start, Zero Rush does not cool at a rate of 238K. It is actually cooling at an idle rate if you're powered up. Request time is the amount of time in seconds that it takes for the cooler to get from 0 to the max rate of 230 kilos per second. So for our example, the Zero Rush will take a little less than 3 seconds to reach the 238K if going from idle to its max rate, or the full 3 seconds from a cold start, either because you just powered up your ship or you're recovering from an EMP. Let's compare this to the Ultraflow. It has a max cooling rate of 440K and a request time of 8 seconds. Great cooling rate, but not so good request time. While I have both of these coolers and these poorly designed graphics up, let me take a second to talk about a common myth amongst the community. When you are splitting your coolers between two different coolers, each cooler adds to the pool of max cooling rate. They work independently. For example, if you pair the Zero Rush with an Ultraflow, the Ultraflow will not inherit the lower request time of the Zero Rush. This also applies to shields and power plants. This may have been the case multiple patches ago, but not now. Don't feel bad, I actually assisted in spreading this rumor in some of my first recommended loadouts. I'm sorry for that, but now we know. Anyway, both of these are great coolers on paper. Let's see how these actually affect your ship in-game. The first test we'll be doing is an acceleration test. In this test, I will be accelerating using full and constant afterburner to the Saber's max speed of around 1235 meters per second. The audio you'll be hearing throughout these tests is from the stock cooler clip. These clips will end at the frame at which it reaches that speed. Watch closely. That was about 5 frames of difference. The next test was recorded seconds after the last and shows how long it took for the ship's temperature to reach idle. During this test, I'm not giving the ship any input. And then I'm going to let it stop itself and cool all the way down. The difference here was about 34 frames or half a second from best to worst. Okay, now let's see how it takes to bring the ship to a complete stop using space brake. We will start when temperatures are stable while traveling at max speed. These clips start at the max speed and end at the frame that shows 0 meters per second.
Danger, engines overheating. Danger, engines overheating. Danger, engines overheating.
That was a 4-frame difference. The next test is a quick one. According to the wiki over at starcitizen.tools, coolers affect the distance you can quantum before overheating, and the cooldown rate of your quantum drive. We already know we can travel across the system without overheating, so we'll just test the latter. I travel from Port Tressler to Microtech L1. The clips start when QT ended and end at the frame just before cooldown disappeared.
Quantum travel complete.
There was no difference even at 60 frames. Myth busted. I think this info was from a past patch. Next, we'll test some weapons. Let's just get this out of the way. I was gonna test the ballistic Mantis Gatling guns, but found that they simply don't overheat. But I'll let you hear it because it sounds good. This is stock. This is overclocked. Oh yeah. Sorry. Now let's take a look at laser weapons. We'll be looking at the size 3 CF series laser repeaters. This clip will start when the first laser appears on screen and ends when the annunciator panel says the weapons have overheated.
Danger, weapon systems overheating. Danger, weapon systems overheating.
That was a 33-second frame or half a second difference in favor of the stock bracers. Next is how long after the last test ended before the overheated light on the annunciator panel disappeared. That was a single frame difference. For the next test, as quickly as I could after they cooled down, I started firing again until the panel says that the weapon's overheated.
Danger. Weapon systems overheating. Danger. Weapon systems overheating.
This was a full 2-second difference, but please note that I believe that this is due to my reaction time between when weapons were no longer overheated and when I started firing. Because the longer you wait after your weapons overheat, the longer you will be able to fire before they overheat again. And this next one is how long after that it took for them to cool down. That was a 9-frame difference. Okay, Subliminal, what about overclocking? Well, let's see. The same as before, first laser to overheat notification. 17-frame difference. Now, how long did it take for them to cool down? Single frame difference once again. Now that they've recovered, how long can I fire until overheated again? 32 frames. And finally, how long until cooldown? That was a 7-frame difference. Alright, so what does all of this mean? Well, it means that coolers really don't do. I did not see much perceivable difference between each cooler. The most was a 2-second difference that I'm sure was a result of slow reaction time on my part. So after doing this research, I've concluded the following. There are 3 options you should go with when picking coolers. First is, if your stock coolers can handle your upgrades, then there's no reason to upgrade them. If you still want to upgrade them, you have 2 options. Either go with grade 1 stealth coolers to get the lowest possible EM/IR emissions, or my personal favorite, go with the lowest draw request time in case you get EMP'd. The IR difference between coolers is negligible in my opinion, but some builds may want to get every bit of stealth you can get your hands on. Of course, all of this depends on whether or not the quick or stealthy coolers have enough capacity. I hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look into coolers. In part 3 in this series, we'll take an in-depth look into power plants. It will be added to the info card, end screen, and description once it's complete. Did I miss anything? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy my channel, there are 6 ways to support it. Number 1, you can smash that like button. Number 2, you can share this content with someone who may enjoy it. Number 3, you can check out my locations of Stanton collection over at Displayed and in the merch store. Number 4, you can follow me on Twitch. I go live after almost every YouTube release. Twitch Prime subs help support the channel. Number 5, you can subscribe and turn on notifications by clicking the circle here. And number 6, if you're feeling generous, consider becoming a channel member or even better, a patron. Some pledge perks can be seen here, including desktop versions of my locations of Stanton collection available to all patrons and channel members. If not, just sticking around until the end is greatly appreciated. Until next time, citizens, I'll see you in the verse.